This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Thank you very much, and thank you, AB Colombia, for inviting me to be here today. It's been a very interesting morning of discussions. I'm going to take more of an international look at things without focusing specifically on the Colombia case. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to address the following. I'll give a brief snapshot of ICMM for those of you that don't know us. I'll look at the potential for the guiding principles to ignite change based on a snapshot of the positive feedback they've received, and also looking at how they've been applied. I'll focus on two implementation challenges. One is applying the guiding principles operating in conflict zones, and another is around some of the reporting and communication requirements of the guiding principles. I'll then provide an overview of how ICMM and our members have been implementing a sectoral approach to applying the guiding principles before highlighting one case study and making some recommendations. Just a quick overview of ICMM. ICMM was formed in 2001 to improve sustainable development performance in the mining and metals industry. Today we're a CEO-led collaborative of 22 of the largest mining and metals companies in the world and 34 regional and commodity associations. We have sites in approximately over 800 sites in 62 countries. Just a quick snapshot of some of the positive feedback that's been received internationally on the guiding principles. You can see they've been praised for being comprehensive, sophisticated and rigorous. They've achieved the objective of being universal, clear, flexible, practical, simple and stable. For ICMM, they really represent a clear and comprehensive framework that clarifies the business state human rights nexus. The success of them, however, will be in how they've been applied. This is a really brief snapshot of a report that was done last year. So there are likely to be many instances that weren't captured in it, and things will have evolved in the last 12 months. You can see that 20 NGOs, 19 companies, a number of countries, regions, investors, academics and legal organizations were already applying the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework, many of them explicitly referencing the guiding principles. In preparing for this panel, we were asked to look at some of the gaps or weaknesses of the guiding principles. As I mentioned, ICMM's view is that the guiding principles represent a comprehensive framework for ensuring that the distinctive yet complementary roles and responsibilities of states and business can be understood and effectively discharged. So it's less about the gaps and really how some of these principles will be applied in practice. On that note, I'm going to focus on the two implementation challenges of applying them on operating in conflict zones and on some of the reporting and communication requirements of the principles. Some of the requirements of the guiding principles can be inherently problematic in conflict situations. For example, guiding principle 18 recommends meaningful engagement with those who are potentially affected. While this is desirable in principle, in practice, working in conflict zones, this may pose risk to stakeholders and to personnel. Disclosure of details of individuals who may have raised allegations may put them at risk and expose them to risks of retribution, as we've seen in a number of countries. Also, many civil and political rights can be restricted by states in exceptional circumstances, such as in conflict zones. The fulfillment of many social, economic and cultural rights is also subject to state resources. So while states have an obligation to protect the human rights of their citizens, they may not always have the resources to do so. This means that companies seeking to ensure respect for human rights need to understand if these restrictions are in place and what it means for them in practice. Another challenge related to applying the guiding principles is their emphasis on conflict-affected countries, and the challenges this poses for companies in identifying which countries are in fact conflict-affected. At face value, this ought to be fairly straightforward, but in reality is a bit more complex. There is no generally accepted one-stop shop that companies, development practitioners or human rights experts can refer to on which countries may present a higher risk that gross human rights violations may occur. This is important if companies are to better understand either where they may need to do enhanced due diligence or when there may be practical constraints to how they approach due diligence. This is not to say that there are no sources of information. However, many sources either tiptoe around the question of conflict or aggregate several indicators of political instability into a single index. For example, Fund for Peace has produced a failed states index for the past 8 years, which provides a valuable early warning indicator for the potential for conflict. It's based on numerous sources of information and key indicators, including violations of human rights and mass movements of refugees. While the indicators also report on a country disaggregated basis, none of the 12 indicators provide an exact indication of conflict. Similarly, the World Bank has taken an increasing focus on fragile and conflict situations, defining fragile states as countries facing particularly severe developmental challenges around weak institutional capacity, poor governance, and political instability. Often these countries experience ongoing violence linked to past conflict, and armed conflicts affect 3 out of 4 fragile states. Like the Failed States Index, this is an aggregate measure of various indicators. There are other examples of conflict mapping tools, including the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo, which has an armed conflicts database, and a 2011 World Development Report, which focuses on conflict, security, and development. The basic point is that while these sources are very interesting and useful for companies to triangulate information, there is no one source for them to use. Having trusted sources of information is important, and understanding how these are constituted is important as well. Another challenge related to the reporting and communication requirements of the Guiding Principles is around Guiding Principle 21, which requires companies to report formally on how they address human rights, where their operations pose risks of severe human rights impacts. The commentary to this principle states that reporting should cover topics and indicators concerning how enterprises identify and address adverse impacts. The challenge for companies in such situations is to balance the public interest in obtaining assurances that companies are taking all reasonable measures to identify and address human rights, while ensuring that disclosures do not present risks to organizations or individuals, either within the company, the community, or civil society. Another challenge was highlighted by a Standard Life report produced in 2011. This looked at compliance with the Guiding Principles based on companies' publicly disclosed information. It broke the requirements of the Guiding Principles down into their 3 main components around requirements of human rights policy, due diligence requirements, and grievance mechanisms policy. You can see that of the 16 companies surveyed, which were based on the 250 constituents in the MSCI Europe Index, and those companies generally seem to have the best practices or some of the better practices. There were strong policy provisions around having human rights policies approved at the most senior level, supporting them with training, outlining the human rights expectations of personnel and stakeholders, and drawing on internationally recognized human rights. Again, all requirements of the Guiding Principles and generally strong across the board of the companies that were looked at. Around the due diligence requirement, there were quite severe gaps. The Guiding Principles require that due diligence is initiated prior to any new activity or relationship, that's based on consultation, that's ongoing, recognizing that human rights impacts will change over time, and it draws on the fact that human rights impacts could be caused by a company's own activities or their partners' activities. And you can see there's a lot less of the companies were actually reporting their alignment with these due diligence requirements. Similarly, there were some gaps around grievance mechanisms and companies reporting how their processes to respond to and remediate against human rights impacts, and reporting on their operational level grievance mechanisms. So there's clearly some challenges there for companies, especially in reporting on their compliance with the guiding principles. I'll now briefly outline how ICMM has been supporting implementation of the guiding principles and the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework. We have produced 3 sector-specific guidances. The first is an overview document which outlines some of the main challenges of the sector, outlines some of the dilemmas that companies in the sector are faced with, and reviews some of the management approaches that have been applied. Our second piece of guidance was on an approach to handling and resolving local level concerns and grievances. We've been piloting this approach with 8 of our members since 2009 when the guide was produced. We really wanted to determine whether it was fit for purpose, and while we recognise now it provides a practical and pragmatic approach to handling complaints, there are implementation challenges that the guide doesn't explore. So the mainstreaming of grievance mechanisms, for example, from site to corporate is often a challenge, as is getting buy-in for grievance mechanisms across departments within companies. Our final set of guidance, which was released earlier this year, is on integrating human rights due diligence into corporate risk management processes. The guide aims to assist companies review their existing processes and identify how they can build on them to adequately address human rights consistent with the UN Guiding Principles. In general, the guide expresses a preference for integrated control systems, building due diligence into existing management processes. It focuses on issues of particular relevance to the sector and suggests 3 possible approaches, and also points companies to other areas of guidance. I'll just outline one example before concluding of where the guiding principles have informed one of our members' corporate risk management processes. One of our members, Barrick Gold, is instituting a global human rights compliance program, which is aligned with the guiding principles, though it aims to go further than the do no harm principle. One element of the compliance program is a remediation framework, which has informed a recent project in Papua New Guinea called All Women Have Rights. The project is the latest action undertaken by Barrick in response to the violence against women in the Porgera area. Guided by the remedy component of the framework, Barrick wanted to ensure they were true to the principle and set a good example of how it could be applied in practice. There is no handbook or a toolkit for this type of work, especially when operating in areas like the Porgera. So they relied on extensive research and consultation with human rights experts, many in the area and international experts, and they relied on internal champions within the company. They consulted with John Ruggie a few times as the program was being developed and defined, and involved a number of NGOs. They briefed their CSR advisory board last month, and Ruggie, who sits on the panel, is extremely encouraging. Other elements of the global human rights compliance system include background checks that screen prospective employers and third-party contractors for human rights violations. These due diligence checks throughout a company's workforce and supply chains are key components of the guiding principles. All Barrick operations and projects will undergo human rights assessments conducted by third-party experts. As noted by Ruggie, Barrick recognises that unless you understand the nature of your risks and the problems you have, you can't put appropriate controls in place. So just to conclude, I've outlined how the Ruggie framework and guiding principles provide an excellent route map. I've highlighted some of the areas where ICMM has developed sector-specific guidance which responds to the framework. I'm not suggesting that applying our approach to grievance mechanisms or due diligence will be smooth sailing, but I am suggesting that sector-specific guidance is important to support enhanced due diligence. I've noted some of the challenges of applying the guiding principles in conflict zones, and on that note, companies need to know whether they be at greater risk of human rights violations and tailor their due diligence accordingly. They should also be mindful of any risks while striving for meaningful engagement and communication on their actions to prevent, mitigate, and remediate human rights impacts. As the guiding principles provide a new normative framework for human rights, companies must know how they are affecting human rights and show that they're applying the guiding principles